Prologue. The calm before the storm. The lake house stood at the edge of Crystal Lake, a serene body of water that mirrored the sky like glass. It was a place of solitude, a retreat from the chaos of the world. For years, it had been the sanctuary of Ethan Cross, a former hero who had hung up his cape to live a quiet life. But the past has a way of catching up, even in the most peaceful places. Ethan had built the lake house with his own hands, a testament to his desire for simplicity. The wooden beams bore the scars of his labor, and the large windows framed the lake like a living painting. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. But tonight, the air felt different. A chill crept in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Ethan stood on the porch, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was coming. The knock came just after midnight, a sharp rap that echoed through the quiet house. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the knife strapped to his belt as he approached the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors at this hour were never good news. When he opened the door, he found a young woman standing on the porch, her face pale and her clothes torn. She looked like she had been running for days. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're coming." Ethan's heart sank. He had left that life behind, but it seemed the world wasn't done with him yet. He stepped aside, letting the woman in. As she crossed the threshold, he noticed the faint glow of a pendant around her neck, a symbol he hadn't seen in years. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "My name is Lila," she said, clutching the pendant, "and I need your help." As Lila sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, Ethan listened to her story. She spoke of a shadowy organization that had resurfaced, one that Ethan had thought he had dismantled years ago. They were after the pendant, an ancient artifact with the power to control time itself. "They killed my father to get it," Lila said, her voice breaking. "He told me to find you. He said you were the only one who could stop them." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had buried that part of his life, but now it was staring him in the face. He couldn't ignore the plea for help, not when innocent lives were at stake. "Stay here," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll keep you safe." But as he turned to secure the house, a noise outside caught his attention. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the trees. Ethan's hand went to his knife again as he peered out the window. They were here. The lake house became a fortress as Ethan prepared for the inevitable. He moved with precision, setting traps and fortifying the doors and windows. Lila watched in awe as the man she had only heard stories about sprang into action. The first wave of attackers came just before dawn. They moved like shadows, their faces obscured by masks. Ethan met them head-on, his movements a blur of speed and precision. He fought with the skill of a man who had spent years honing his craft, but even he couldn't hold them off forever. As the battle raged, Lila discovered a hidden compartment in the pendant. Inside was a small, intricately carved key. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she knew it was important. "Ethan," she called, holding up the key. "We need to get out of here." He nodded, grabbing her hand and leading her to a secret passage hidden beneath the floorboards. They emerged on the other side of the lake, where a small boat waited. "Where are we going?" Lila asked as they rowed away from the house. "Somewhere safe," Ethan replied. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. Blackwater Lake was a place of unsettling beauty. Its dark, still waters reflected the dense forest that surrounded it, and the air was always thick with the scent of pine and decay. Locals spoke of the lake in hushed tones, warning outsiders to stay away. They said the lake was cursed, that it had claimed too many lives over the years. On opposite sides of the lake stood two abandoned lake houses. They were mirror images of each other, built decades ago by twin brothers who had mysteriously vanished one fateful night. The houses had been left to rot, their windows shattered and their walls covered in ivy. But every now and then, strange lights could be seen flickering in the windows, and faint whispers carried on the wind. No one dared to go near the lake houses until now. Maya and Jake, two siblings in their late 20s, had inherited the lake houses from their late uncle, who had purchased them as an investment. They had grown up hearing stories about Blackwater Lake, but they had always dismissed them as superstition. Now, with their uncle gone and the houses left to them, they decided to visit and assess the properties. As they drove down the narrow, overgrown road that led to the lake, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. When they finally reached the first lake house, they were struck by its eerie beauty. "Creepy," Jake said, stepping out of the car. "But kinda cool too." Maya nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house loomed before them, its weathered wood groaning in the wind. The second house was visible across the lake, its silhouette barely distinguishable through the mist. "Let's check this one out first," Maya said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The inside of the first lake house was a time capsule of the 1970s. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and dusty furniture sat untouched. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floorboards creaked with every step. As they explored, Maya noticed something strange. The house was filled with mirrors, huge, ornate mirrors that seemed out of place in such a modest home. Each one was cracked or tarnished, their surfaces reflecting distorted images of the room. "Why would anyone need this many mirrors?" Jake asked, running a finger along the edge of one. Maya didn't answer. She was too busy staring at her reflection. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, a shadowy figure that vanished as soon as she turned around. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice trembling. In the master bedroom, they found a journal lying on the bed. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles, the handwriting barely legible. The entries spoke of strange noises, flickering lights, and a feeling of being watched. The last entry was dated the night the brothers disappeared. "We shouldn't have come here," Maya whispered. The second lake house was even more unsettling than the first. While the first house had been frozen in time, this one looked like it had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols painted in what looked like blood. "What the hell happened here?" Jake muttered, stepping over a broken chair. Maya's attention was drawn to a large mirror in the living room. Unlike the others, this one was intact, its surface gleaming despite the layer of dust. As she approached it, she felt a cold draft, as if the mirror was exhaling. "Jake, look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He joined her, and together they stared at their reflections. For a moment, everything was normal. Then, slowly, their reflections began to change. their faces twisted into grotesque masks, their eyes black and hollow. Maya screamed and stumbled back, but Jake couldn't look away. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the mirror. The surface rippled like water, and a cold, bony hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. Jake managed to pull free, and they fled the house, not stopping until they were back at the first lake house. As they caught their breath, Maya noticed something she hadn't seen before, a trapdoor hidden beneath a rug in the living room. With trembling hands, they opened it and descended into the darkness below. The basement was filled with more mirrors, each one covered in a black cloth. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface stained with dried blood. On the altar lay a book, its pages filled with incantations and rituals. As Maya flipped through it, she realized the truth. The twin brothers had been practitioners of dark magic. They had used the mirrors as portals to another realm, summoning something that had ultimately consumed them. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The mirrors around them began to rattle, and the air grew colder. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, and faint whispers filled the air. Hollow Shores was a remote, desolate lake nestled deep in the woods. It was a place of stark contrasts. The water was crystal clear, but the surrounding forest was dense and foreboding. On either side of the lake stood two identical lake houses, built by a reclusive architect who had vanished without a trace. The houses were perfect mirrors of each other, down to the smallest detail. But while one was pristine and inviting, the other was decaying and sinister. Locals called them the twin houses, and they whispered that the houses were alive, that they fed on the fears of those who entered. No one had dared to stay in either house for decades, until now. Emma and Liam, a couple in their early 30s, had been struggling in their relationship. Emma, a writer, was looking for inspiration for her next novel, while Liam, a photographer, was desperate to reconnect with her. When they received an anonymous invitation to stay at one of the lake houses for a week, they saw it as an opportunity to heal and rekindle their love. The invitation came with a single rule: do not cross the lake. When they arrived at Hollow Shores, they were struck by the beauty of the first lake house. It was warm and welcoming, with a cozy interior and large windows that overlooked the lake. The second house, visible across the water, was shrouded in shadow, its windows dark and its walls covered in ivy. "This place is amazing," Emma said, stepping inside. "It's like something out of a dream." Liam nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As he unpacked his camera, he noticed something strange. The second house seemed to shift and change every time he looked at it, as if it were alive. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint lapping of water against the shore. Emma sat by the fireplace, jotting down ideas for her novel, while Liam scrolled through the photos he had taken earlier. "Did you see this?" Liam asked, holding up his camera. Emma leaned over to look. The photo showed the second house, but it was different. The windows were glowing with a faint, eerie light, and the ivy seemed to writhe like snakes. "That's weird," Emma said, frowning. "Maybe it's just a trick of the light." But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The fireplace flickered and died, even though there was plenty of wood. The windows rattled, though there was no wind, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. Too soft to make out, but too persistent to ignore. The next morning, Emma woke up feeling uneasy. She had dreamed of the second house, of standing in its dark, decaying halls and hearing her own voice calling to her from the shadows. When she mentioned it to Liam, he admitted that he had dreamed of it too. "Maybe we should check it out," Liam said, trying to sound casual, "just to put our minds at ease." Emma hesitated. The invitation had explicitly warned them not to cross the lake, but curiosity gnawed at her. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They rowed across the lake in silence, the water unnaturally still. As they approached the second house, the air grew colder, and the sunlight seemed to dim. The house loomed before them, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. Inside, the house was a twisted reflection of the first. The furniture was the same, but it was broken and covered in dust. The walls were lined with mirrors, but their surfaces were cracked and blackened, as if they had been burned. "This place gives me the creeps," Liam muttered, his voice echoing through the empty halls. As they explored, Emma noticed something strange. The mirrors didn't reflect the room. Instead, they showed the first house, but it was dark and empty, as if it had been abandoned for years. That night, the strange occurrences grew worse. Emma and Liam began to hear footsteps in the halls, though no one was there. The whispers grew louder, and they started to hear their own voices, taunting and mocking them. Emma found herself drawn to the windows, staring across the lake at the second house. She could see movement in the windows, shadowy figures that seemed to be watching her. "We need to leave," Liam said, his voice trembling. "This place is messing with our heads." But Emma couldn't tear herself away. She felt a strange connection to the second house, as if it were calling to her. That night, she dreamed of it again, but this time, she wasn't alone. She saw herself standing in the dark halls, her reflection staring back at her with a twisted smile. The next morning, Emma woke up feeling different. She was colder, more distant, and her eyes had a strange, hollow look. Liam noticed the change but didn't say anything, afraid of what it might mean. As the days passed, the divide between them grew. Emma spent more and more time staring at the second house, while Liam became increasingly paranoid. He started to see things, shadows moving in the corners of his vision, figures standing in the windows of the second house. One night, Emma disappeared. Liam searched the house but couldn't find her. When he looked across the lake, he saw her standing in the window of the second house, her face pale and her eyes empty. Ashen Lake was a place of haunting beauty, its waters dark and still, reflecting the gnarled trees that surrounded it. The lake was named for the ash that seemed to fall from the sky, though no one could explain its source. On either side of the lake stood two grand lake houses built by the Blackwood and Hargrove families, two rival clans whose feud had spanned generations. The families had once been close, bound by friendship and shared prosperity. But a bitter betrayal had torn them apart, and the lake had become a battleground. Legend had it that the lake was cursed, that the spirits of the dead lingered in its depths, waiting for revenge. Now, decades later, the last descendants of the Blackwood and Hargrove families had returned to the lake houses, unaware of the darkness that awaited them. Eleanor Blackwood had inherited her family's lake house after the death of her estranged father. She hadn't been to Ashen Lake since she was a child, but the memories of its eerie beauty had stayed with her. She arrived on a cold, overcast day, the ash falling like snow as she stepped out of her car. The Blackwood house was a sprawling, Gothic mansion, its dark stone walls covered in ivy. The windows were like empty eyes staring out at the lake. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Across the lake, Daniel Hargrove was doing the same. The Hargrove house was a mirror image of the Blackwood house, but where the Blackwood house was dark and foreboding, the Hargrove house was light and airy, its white walls gleaming in the dim light. Daniel had inherited the house from his grandfather, who had always spoken of it with a mix of pride and fear. As night fell, the two houses stood like sentinels on either side of the lake, their windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Eleanor spent her first night in the Blackwood house unpacking and exploring. The house was filled with relics of her family's past, old portraits, dusty books, and strange artifacts. In the library, she found a journal belonging to her great-grandmother, its pages filled with cryptic entries about the curse of Ashen Lake. "The lake demands blood," one entry read. "The sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children." Eleanor dismissed it as superstition, but as the night wore on, she began to feel uneasy. The house was too quiet, the silence oppressive. She heard faint whispers in the halls, though no one was there, and the portraits seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. Across the lake, Daniel was experiencing similar strange occurrences. The Hargrove house, though bright and welcoming during the day, felt sinister at night. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Daniel found himself drawn to the lake, where he saw faint lights flickering beneath the surface. The next morning, Eleanor decided to explore the lake. As she walked along the shore, she saw Daniel on the other side. They waved to each other, and after a moment of hesitation, they rowed out to meet in the middle of the lake. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. "Daniel Hargrove," he replied, shaking it. "I didn't know anyone else was here." They talked for a while, sharing stories about their families and their reasons for returning to the lake. But as the conversation turned to the strange occurrences in their houses, they grew uneasy. "Do you believe in curses?" Eleanor asked, half joking. Daniel's expression darkened. "I didn't used to, but after last night." They decided to investigate the history of the lake together, hoping to find answers. But as they rowed back to their respective houses, they felt a strange pull, as if the lake itself was watching them. Eleanor and Daniel spent the next few days researching the history of their families and the lake. They discovered that their ancestors had been close friends until a bitter betrayal had torn them apart. The Blackwoods had accused the Hargroves of stealing a valuable artifact, and the feud had escalated into violence. The final confrontation had taken place on the lake, where both families had been wiped out in a mysterious tragedy. The lake had been cursed ever since, its waters said to be filled with the spirits of the dead. As they delved deeper, they found evidence of a dark ritual, a pact made with the lake to ensure the survival of their bloodlines. But the ritual had gone wrong, and the spirits of the dead had been trapped in the lake, waiting for revenge. That night, the strange occurrences grew worse. Eleanor and Daniel began to see shadowy figures in their houses, their faces twisted with rage. The whispers grew louder, and they started to hear their own names being called. Eleanor found herself drawn to the lake, where she saw the spirits of her ancestors standing on the water, their eyes glowing with malice. Daniel experienced the same, the spirits of the Hargroves calling to him, demanding justice. They realized that the curse could only be broken by atoning for their ancestors' sins. But the spirits were not willing to wait. Whisper Lake was a secluded, mist-shrouded body of water hidden deep in the wilderness. It was a place of eerie silence, where the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. On either side of the lake stood two abandoned lake houses, their windows dark and their doors sealed shut. The houses had been built by a reclusive couple in the 1920s, but they had vanished without a trace shortly after moving in. Over the years, others had tried to live in the houses, but they too had disappeared, leaving behind only cryptic notes and unsettling clues. The locals called the houses the Echo Houses, and they warned that the lake was a place where reality itself was thin, where the boundaries between worlds could be crossed. Clara and Marcus, a young couple seeking solitude, had rented one of the lake houses for a month. Clara, a painter, was looking for inspiration, while Marcus, a writer, hoped to finish his novel. They had chosen the house on the north side of the lake, drawn by its rustic charm and the promise of peace and quiet. As they drove down the narrow, overgrown road that led to the lake, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the mist hung low over the water. When they finally reached the house, they were struck by its eerie beauty. "It's perfect," Clara said, stepping out of the car. "So quiet." Marcus nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house loomed before them, its weathered wood groaning in the wind. The second house, visible across the lake, was shrouded in shadow, its windows dark and its walls covered in ivy. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint lapping of water against the shore. Clara sat by the fireplace, sketching ideas for her next painting, while Marcus typed away on his laptop. "Do you hear that?" Clara asked, looking up from her sketchpad. Marcus paused, listening. There was a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from outside. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and the air grew colder. Clara and Marcus began to hear footsteps in the halls, though no one was there. The windows rattled and the fireplace flickered and died, even though there was plenty of wood. The next morning, Clara woke up feeling uneasy. She had dreamed of the second house, of standing in its dark, decaying halls and hearing her own voice calling to her from the shadows. When she mentioned it to Marcus, he admitted that he had dreamed of it too. "Maybe we should check it out," Marcus said, trying to sound casual. "Just to put our minds at ease." Clara hesitated. The rental agreement had explicitly warned them not to cross the lake, but curiosity gnawed at her. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They rowed across the lake in silence, the water unnaturally still. As they approached the second house, the air grew colder, and the sunlight seemed to dim. The house loomed before them, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. Inside, the house was a twisted reflection of the first. The furniture was the same, but it was broken and covered in dust. The walls were lined with mirrors, but their surfaces were cracked and blackened, as if they had been burned. "This place gives me the creeps," Marcus muttered, his voice echoing through the empty halls. As they explored, Clara noticed something strange. The mirrors didn't reflect the room. Instead, they showed the first house, but it was dark and empty, as if it had been abandoned for years. That night, the strange occurrences grew worse. Clara and Marcus began to hear footsteps in the halls, though no one was there. The whispers grew louder, and they started to hear their own voices, taunting and mocking them. Clara found herself drawn to the windows, staring across the lake at the second house. She could see movement in the windows, shadowy figures that seemed to be watching her. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "This place is messing with our heads." But Clara couldn't tear herself away. She felt a strange connection to the second house, as if it were calling to her. That night, she dreamed of it again. But this time, she wasn't alone. She saw herself standing in the dark halls, her reflection staring back at her with a twisted smile. The next morning, Clara woke up feeling different. She was colder, more distant, and her eyes had a strange, hollow look. Marcus noticed the change but didn't say anything, afraid of what it might mean. As the days passed, the divide between them grew. Clara spent more and more time staring at the second house, while Marcus became increasingly paranoid. He started to see things, shadows moving in the corners of his vision, figures standing in the windows of the second house. One night, Clara disappeared. Marcus searched the house but couldn't find her. When he looked across the lake, he saw her standing in the window of the second house, her face pale and her eyes empty.